It's always pleasant to be back with John and others, as well as some of the icons down on the second floor. I remember being a young monk in Thailand 30 plus years ago and reading about or listening to tapes of Krishnamurti, Annie Besant, Colonel Olcott, and those folks who, if you think back to the time, pretty incredible stuff. And some of it was happening in Wheaton, of all places, which is famous for some other religious things as well. So it's interesting how the world turns, and I'll not get into current affairs too much. We're at a phase of Buddhist development in the US and the West that's dovetailing with other things such as neuroscience, psychology, trauma therapy, and mindfulness is going through a boom phase. I know from Thai history, things like this can be cyclical. Different parts of Thailand that I'm familiar with, there would be a boom period of 20, 30 years of lots of people meditating, and then that would fade, and then another area, things would coalesce, and these things would be arising, hanging around for a while, and then passing away, often around the lives of teachers, monks, lay people, men, women. And back in the day, Thailand wasn't a unified nation state. The communities were quite disparate. Anyway, now it's 21st century mindfulness of various kinds, the whole gamut from Google mindfulness to CIA mindfulness to mindfulness-based stress reduction to kind of hardcore official Buddhist mindfulness is getting lots of attention, including in the neuroscience labs. There's a lot that's wonderful and fascinating about these developments. And so tonight I thought I'd use the opportunity to link the various forms and approaches of mindfulness that are now widespread in our society with some early, very early Buddhist perspectives. I'd like to draw on one specific passage in the early strata of Buddhist texts. And this passage occurs twice, and there are two different narratives around it. Tonight I'll focus on one of the narratives, because sometimes it's nice to get the framing story. that carry these teachings. Occasionally we get the sort of desiccated form of the old teachings, especially when they've been hashed over by scholars. I increasingly enjoy digging up and pondering the original context, and especially when we have some archaeology or cultural studies to flesh out what might have been going on. So one of the stories that contains the teaching I'll focus on tonight involves an ascetic known as Bahiya, Bahiya of the bark cloth. And the bark cloth seems to refer to a tendency in India that time that certain ascetics would take on particular vows. And the best explanation I've heard about Bahiya is that he was a devotee of a particular Upanishadic teachings. The Upanishads were early Vedic teachings that both predated, coexisted with, and postdated the Buddha. And one of these groups of texts, which were oral texts in the Buddha's time, kind of like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey before they were written down, focused on trees. And the bark cloth seems to have been a way to express one's devotion by wearing clothes made of bark. Don't ask me how it was done. I imagine it took a lot of pounding to perhaps get cloth out of bark. The cultural studies I've heard of haven't yet replicated the methodology. Anyway, the point that's relevant is Bahiya was not a Buddhist. He was not a follower of the Buddha, but was devoted to one of the principal teachings, somewhat philosophical, of that time. I'm not going to say more about those teachings because it's not my area of study, though it's likely that the Buddha had some, at least passing knowledge of that teaching, and this partly gives background to the teaching. So Bahiya was practicing under a tree. The Buddha also liked to do that. And Bahiya was by the seashore somewhere, and it entered his head that he might be one of the worthy ones. This was a term used in Buddhism and other traditions of that time. And it's possible Bahiya didn't actually think in this term, but the Buddhists who wrote down the story and edited it to their purposes might have put their label onto Bahiya. But anyway, according to the Buddhists, not the bark cloth people, it entered into Bahiya's head that he was a worthy one, which means those who are far from greed, hatred, delusion, that is, freed of egoism, which is the highest aspiration in early Buddhism. So Bahiya had this notion, and the tree spirit of that particular tree kind of whispered to him and said, sorry, not yet. And I guess the news was a little hard on Bahiya, but he was sincere and devout and decided, well, if the tree spirit says I'm not there yet, maybe I should ask the tree spirit what to do next. And according to the Buddhist story, and notice I'm copying to the Buddhists tell stories about people from other traditions, sometimes with bias, even if we're supposed to not be biased. So according to the Buddhist story, the tree spirit says, you should find this person who's reported to be an awakened one, a perfectly self-awakened Buddha. And then there are traditional Buddhist descriptions. And Bahiya asked, do you know where he is? And the tree spirit pointed him. And Bahiya traveled a long distance from the sea to the Ganges Valley, and asking as he went, eventually tracked down the Buddha and met up with the Buddha when he was on his morning alms round, collecting rice and victuals in the area where he was staying. And in the Buddha's custom was to collect alms mindfully and not get in conversations. So Bahiya came up and bowed and said, help me out, I just traveled from Timbuktu or wherever, and I really need your advice. And the Buddha tried to get him to wait. He said, I'm on alms round, I'll talk to you later. And Bahiya, understandably, after his long, arduous journey, wanted to get what he could as soon as possible. And when you hear the way the story plays out in the end, he actually had good reason to not dilly-dally. But the Buddha didn't respond. So he tried again, and the Buddha said, I'm on alms round, could you wait? I'm paraphrasing, by the way. And then on the third attempt, the Buddha said, okay, this is a Buddhist custom that often the Buddha wouldn't respond to the third time. Theosophists are probably aware that 3 is a big number in sacred texts, including Buddhist. So, but the Buddha's still on alms round, so he gave Bahiya a quick little teaching. In the seen, let there only be seeing. In the heard, let there only be hearing. In the experienced, let there only be experiencing. In the known, let there only be knowing. This is paraphrased a lot by Buddhist teachers. Sometimes you'll hear it in the seeing, or in seeing, just see. In hearing, just hear. In experiencing, just experience. In knowing, or in being aware, just be aware. And Bahiya, who was devout, sincere, and bright, signaled that he got it. And then the Buddha carried on. And so I get this right. Bahiya, when in the seen there's merely seeing, in the heard there's merely hearing, in the experienced merely experiencing, and in the known merely knowing, then you will not be with that. When you are not with that, then you will not be in that. And when you are not in that, you will be neither here, nor beyond, nor in between. Just this is the end of dukkha, the end of suffering, which is the way the Buddha framed the purpose of his teaching, the end of suffering. So, entitling this the heart of mindfulness, this teaching, which is very much about pure mindfulness, it also points to why, according to early Buddhism. Bahiya, according to the story, took this to heart, practiced diligently, and became one of the worthy ones. And shortly thereafter, got between a cow and her calf and was, the way I've read it, gored to death. I guess some cows have horns. And I've gotten between a deer and her fawn. Sometimes moms can get serious if you get in the way of their children. And Bahiya came to an untimely end. When this was reported to the Buddha instructed the monks to treat Bahiya with all due respect, because he had practiced the core of Buddha's Dhamma and realized what it's all about. And so Bahiya became accepted within the Buddhist corpus of, if you like, saints. Men and women who've had stories about them told over and over, as I've just done, for 2,400, 500 years, now all over the planet. sometimes people want to spend a lot of time asking about, well, how did he get gored by a cow, or what's this about the bark? Or are there really tree spirits? If you'd like to talk about that, I suggest coming back around midnight. I won't be here. I'm sure you can Google it. But what I'd like to do is come back and visit this teaching from a practice perspective. So for the next 10, 15 minutes, I'd like to invite each of you to be mindful. I'll do a little coaching, and those who are watching this through the internet, please join us. The first part of Buddha's teaching, which, as I've said, is basically the essence of mindfulness, starts with the sense of vision. So as you sit here, let your eyes calmly roam about the room. Please don't stare at me. There's some different stuff in the room, some of it quite beautiful, other rather mundane. Let your eyes roam, and if your attention lands on something, take it in for a few moments, and then roam some more. And pay attention. Pay attention especially to the sense of vision, seeing. Take in visual experiencing wherever your attention lands. We're going to do this for a few minutes, so please don't expect it to end soon. Just keep paying attention to seeing. It's fine to do it in a relaxed, non-effortful way. And you're doing this with some self-awareness or mindfulness. I'm wondering if sometimes there's just seeing, just an experience of seeing something, and that's all. I'm not suggesting you think about that. Just keep letting the eyes roam, seeing a water pot, a fire alarm, a chair, the back of a head. And being open to the possibility that at times it's simply seeing with nothing added. And then other times our eyes land on something and there might be words, thoughts, questions. What kind of Buddha is that? Or what's that made out of? Or what sort of hairstyle? I think I know that head. And sometimes we get caught up and we start telling a story. We see something. And I remember back in high school when I was in the lighting club, working on high school plays and hanging lights like this and getting my fingers burnt. Sometimes we see something and there's liking and disliking, judgment. Opinions. So now I've given some examples of options that are beyond just seeing. Let's close our eyes and shift to the sense of hearing and sounds. There aren't as many available unless I start going around banging on things. But there are some sounds in the room besides my voice. Something humming. Eventually there'll be a sneeze or a cough. And again, are there moments of just hearing? Instead of perhaps finding the hum to be annoying or pleasant, or thinking, what's making that sound? In a noisier environment, there'd be many more sounds. later tonight, tomorrow, you'll have plenty of opportunities to continue this with more sound options. As with vision, we can be especially mindful of hearing, noticing when there's extra words, thoughts, stories, elaborations, reactions, opinions. Sometimes, though, there's just hearing. One reason for the tradition of practicing in nature, say in the woods, is because we tend to have more moments of just seeing, just hearing, while at home and work, we're a lot more invested personally, egoistically, and it's easier to get caught up and less likely to notice just hearing. Next, let's be aware of bodies. Be aware of the weight of the body meeting chair, both in our seats and backs. Other touch points, feet, these body sensations. We could call it just sensing. Or are there words and stories? Something's uncomfortable and we react. Or breathing, sensing flow of breath, perhaps just sensing, just breathing. Sometimes missing that because there's some busyness going on. Thinking about how my breath should be, trying to make it better. There could be some aches or tensions to be felt. Are they just felt? Or is there more going on? It's possible that odors and flavors would come into play as well. Let's move on to knowing or cognizing, which most simply is being aware. Whatever shows up in awareness, aware of sound, aware of breath, aware of a memory, a thought. If we watch long enough, we might catch when there's just a memory. A memory arises and passes, or just a thought. Or we see something. We recognize it, and that's it. Just knowing. Other times, the memory triggers things. It draws us in more memory, active involvement, playing it out, reliving it, maybe stirring up old emotions. If your eyes are closed, feel free to keep them closed or to open as you like. I'll carry on with the talk. My understanding of this teaching is it takes mindfulness somewhat deeper than the way mindfulness is often presented. The sort of be here now. Although it depends how we understand be here now. Just paying attention is essential to mindfulness. But if we're really paying attention, we start to notice subtleties like the one that's the focus of tonight's teaching. What's the difference between just seeing, just hearing, just experiencing, just knowing, and the rest of the time. The rest of the time is all kinds of stuff. Some of it pretty confused, some of it just trivial, most of it involving me and mine. I believe Buddha was taking Bahiya's sincerity and guiding it to pay special attention, that is, to be mindful of this heart of mindfulness where as we go through life, as we experience, we're either adding according to our needs, desires, reactions, and often our ego stuff, whether it's mild, moderate, or out of control. And yet, I'm willing to bet that if we keep paying attention and are honest and sincere like Bahiya, we'll have at least glimpses where it seems something was really simple. Just hearing, just experiencing, even a memory, just the memory passing through without making a whole story, a whole drama or reaction about it. Even given our complex lives here in North America of the 21st century, where making plans is required. So hopefully this isn't ruining the Buddha's teaching, when there's a need to plan, just plan the necessary planning and leave it at that without all the emotional, egoistic baggage. I hope that's possible. And mindfulness isn't just aware, oh, now I'm planning, or now I'm remembering, or now I'm seeing this, hearing that, oops, I got angry, oops, now I'm all greedy for who knows what. It's more than just going, yeah, oh, that happened, yeah, this happened. But sharpening the mindfulness that we catch glimpses of just seeing, just hearing, mere experiencing, mere knowing. Simple, if you like, pure. This reading is influenced by the second part of the teaching. If Bahiya, or in the other story, the old monk named Malunkya Putta, son of Malunkya, who, by the way, appears in a few different places in early Buddhist teachings, and in the earlier appearances is kind of headstrong, pig-headed, doesn't really listen very well, forms opinions that are half-baked and gets admonished. But then he shows up at the end of his life, humble, approaches the Buddha and said, "I'm old." Which I take to mean, okay, I'm not so pig-headed and headstrong anymore. I'm old, I'm running out of time. Please point me to some gem or essence of practice, because I don't have a lot more time. I take that to mean the Buddha recognized that this guy who in the past had formed some half-baked opinions and was kind of pushy about them had relaxed all that and was like Bahiya, sincere. And so Buddha gave him the straight dope, simple, very clear, okay, same thing. In the seeing, let there just be seeing. In the heard, let there just be hearing. In the experience, let there just be experiencing. In the known, or some translations, in the cognized, let there just be knowing, just cognizing. Just take it in, just know it, just be aware. To both of these, Bahiya and Malunkyaputta, Buddha then goes on, if we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, smell, taste, touch fall under experiencing, and then cognizing or knowing, then here's another translation, you will not be. When you are not, you will not be in that. When the being in the world, it's important to recognize this teaching, it's not about escaping to the astral plane or going in some deep meditative trance or any supernormal stuff. It's being with the senses. And this is actually pretty common in early Buddhist teachings. Later Buddhism got into all the fancy schmancy stuff. But a lot of the early teachings were not trying to get out of the world, out of the body, out of sense experience. But it's advice on how to be with seeing, hearing, experiencing, knowing. If it's this simple seeing, hearing, experiencing, knowing, then nobody is created when nobody is fabricated or assumed, then nobody's in the experience. So I take this to be some further pointing to just seeing means It doesn't need a me seeing. And then if this extra of me seeing isn't projected, then whatever the visual experience is, there's no me that's having it, with it, in it. How often do we see or hear something and then we stick ourselves in it? We start taking it personally, and this is where our elaborations get kind of gooey and messy and sticky. The Buddha's pointing out that you will not be in that, and if nobody is in it or with it, then you're neither here nor beyond or over there, this life, next life, this room, next room, today, tomorrow, nor in between. How often do we think we're somewhere or wanting to go somewhere, or we're in transition? Kind of covers most of the territory where we keep projecting ourselves. When nobody's in and with the seeing, the hearing, the experiencing, the knowing, then nobody has to be here. Nobody has to be somewhere else. Nobody's in between. I know modern capitalism will fall apart if everybody takes this to heart. But if we really need to, we can play along out of compassion or something. Just this is the end of suffering. So I offer this retelling and commentary on a very well-known passage from early Buddhist teaching. It worked, according to the stories, for both Bahiya and Malunkyaputta. It's something that we can explore going about our lives. We don't need to make special arrangements, except perhaps to slow down enough that we can actually pay attention and start having mindfulness that goes deeper than just, oh yeah, sound or anger or fear or whatever, which it's important to notice all that, but then drop down further to a deeper, clearer, simpler mindfulness of just seeing, just hearing, just experiencing, just knowing. Just this is the end of suffering.
So I have sort of a technical question. When we first began with seeing and just seeing, in my yoga practice, a teacher would describe, and I'm asking if I'm on the right track or with this, the right path. She would describe it as like letting the eyes receive the image without, and a lot of us, kind of reach with our eyes or we reach with our ears. And so I'm just sort of asking if that's sort of getting into the right flavor of the approach that you're describing.
I think so. It's a slightly different languaging than I'm used to. In Buddhist teaching, it's kind of our eyes and whatever seem kind of arise together. But that's a bit maybe overly technical right now. So yeah, this way we reach out with our senses kind of ready to get involved, ready to react. So I think what your yoga teacher's advising is to help us just rest in awareness.
And that's the same.
Sounds pretty close, yeah. And then from there, explore and learn it with we really learn these not from a teacher, but from our own exploration. Teachers kind of might help us get started.
So this is kind of half-baked, but but when you were describing this idea, what I was connecting it with, and I'm wondering if this is what you were partially talking about, was using the mind to know the mind, or using the ego to know the ego, and kind of like the idea of, like, we have to start with knowing a self so that we can know that we don't have a self. Is this, if this wasn't what you were at all talking about, could you address that in some way?
Sure. I didn't consciously imply that what you just mentioned about having an ego or a self to know when we don't. I would rephrase it. I'm thinking of something the Dalai Lama wrote when he was quite young that addresses this, that it's hard to understand emptiness of self until we've noticed how self or ego or me shows up in all the different ways. So an assumption of this is happening to me, I'm seeing this is mine, I'm doing this. Those are just a few that get elaborated with all the activities and experiences of life. I'm angry. Instead of, oh, anger, it's generally taken to be, I'm angry, I'm hot, I'm cold, this is my car, what are you doing on my chair? And sometimes it's just language, but usually there's more than just the term. We take these pronouns, me, mine, him, her, you, yours, pretty seriously. Being mindful of those seem to be a prerequisite to noticing when, oh, right now, it's just seeing. It's not me seeing, it's just seeing. And for myself, it's way back, it's catching, I'm angry, catching that kind of crude reaction, or I'm impatient, or I'm nervous. And so catching the agitation of, say, nervousness or impatience, and then observing that and seeing the me in it, the self-centeredness, the narcissism in it, and then watching this and discovering more subtle layers, and at times catching a more subtle me that then got nervous. In my understanding, often, like certain situations like right now, when you ask the question, how self-conscious are you? If there's not a whole lot of me, there's not going to be much or any self-consciousness. The more me, the more self-consciousness, or me trying to look good, me trying to be smart. But if it starts with little or no me, then this other stuff doesn't follow. But depending how our mindfulness practice has developed, we might start, I did, by catching it down the line when it's more gross. Like, oh, what are people thinking about me? Or they better not, somebody snickered, what's going on? But to keep watching it, noticing more and more subtle stuff, and then sometimes they're seeing in just a little bit of me. It seems I'm seeing or hearing. And then sometimes maybe no me. And I've learned if I form an opinion, there's no me, there's me. Opinions, somebody's always got it. No me, there's no need for an opinion. There might be knowing, but it doesn't have to become an opinion.
My understanding is that mainly the function of the mind is to worries of the past and anxieties of the future. And when your topic says the heart of the mindfulness, the heart is more feelings, which is the present moment feeling. So I think the topic is saying that watch the mind jump from the past memories to future anxieties, get to the heart of it. Mindfulness is, be in the present moment and don't get caught up of interpretation of seeing. Let's take a seeing example. When I'm seeing, immediately mind jumps up to say, like that tree, I see the tree. Oh no, I've seen a better tree before. Bad.
You don't like
that's
this
not.
tree?
Yeah, it's not as good as I have seen before.
It's my tree, you better like it.
So that jumping into interpreting or comparing, we lose the mindfulness right there.
Right.
And then the heart of the mindfulness is to stay in the present moment, and when I'm seeing, just to see only but not interpret. Or stay with the present moment seeing, not interpret it from the ideas I have about it.
Right.
Is that what?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. And again, we live in a complex world. And for example, Buddha would respond to questions. So right now, you and I really don't need to have interpretations of this tree, right? But some things we do, it might be your job or somebody's hurt. You want to interpret what's going on, what happened, how can we help? So sometimes these higher cognitive functions have a role. If we're good at just seeing, just hearing, then we also learn to just think or even let ourselves feel someone's pain, be open to someone's sorrow, grief, and rather than our reactions or interpreting it, judging it, so that we can really respond to situations.
Thank you for your presentation. Is the collective of this equanimity? Is that what is meant by equanimity?
It could. Equanimity in the word that's translated equanimity in Buddhist circles has varying meanings. So sometimes it means non-bias or not having preferences. This person, that person, you're not for one against another. Yeah, it means nonpartisan politics, for example. But one still makes choices, but not based on who one likes, who one doesn't like. Other times it means more like non-reactivity. And I think tonight's talk touches on both of those. It can also be used, and this is less relevant, a kind of feeling tone that's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. That's a more obscure usage. But I don't know where you've heard the word equanimity, but it gets used in different ways. Hmm? Oh. So I've heard of Steiner, but not that familiar. So you'd have to look up what Steiner meant by equanimity.
When I read it, I kind of still wondered. That's why I asked.
Well, I'm not a Steiner guy. But it's at least a hypothesis. This might be what Steiner meant, and then you got to go track down what Steiner said about equanimity. And ultimately, if you're a bit of a scholar, you like to read like I do, you track some of this down. It can be useful, I believe, or fun. But whether you call it equanimity or don't bother calling it anything, because sometimes in just knowing, you don't need to call it something because you know the experience. The experience is clear enough, it doesn't require the label. But if you come across the word equanimity and you need to make sense of it, then you go, it might be something like this, and that'll be richer if it's been touched in a more deeply mindful way.
Early on, you had talked about the cyclical nature of mindfulness, both in Thailand and here. I can understand it being here, being in America, but with a Buddhist or Buddhism is a major religion in Thailand. What causes do you think bringing away from having a mindfulness as there?
Oh, that gets into the diversity of official Buddhist teachings, hierarchies, and what they do, and what happens on the popular village level. So it's like, look at Christianity, for example, and it's, it seems to me, all over the map. And that'll be true in a Buddhist country. Some pretty wacko stuff goes on in the name of Buddhism. And some of it's ugly, you know. There's misogyny, there's classism that's justified by what I think are misguided Buddhist interpretations. So that happens, or popular Buddhism gets into various things. And the importance of mindfulness practice may not have much role because people are concerned with other stuff, earning merit for future lives or something, or magic. Magic's been popular. But sometimes, often, it's a small group of people or one teacher has good and strong character, commands respect not because they've got power, just their compassion and clarity and ethical upstandingness. People listen. And such a person can leverage that and encourage, hey folks, you ought to try this mindfulness stuff or meditation. And in Thai villages, the languaging can be different things. Like one teacher just talks about feeling. It's just feel it. There's a teacher, Luang Pa Tien, he died 15 years ago, but I knew some of his students. And he taught a very simple approach for people who had maybe tried other forms of meditation and felt they couldn't do it. He taught an approach: you lift your hand, you move it a certain way, you lift your other one, and people just do that repetitively, and the instruction is feel your hand moving. And that's what he meant, just feel. And the student of his I knew pretty well, played off of that, just feel. And if you can feel your hand moving, you can feel your feet walking. You can feel your lips moving, your tongue, your chewing. And so you start feeling all these things. And in that, there's mindfulness. So it takes somebody who's got a certain presence, integrity, enough to get people to listen, and people start checking it out, and then they talk their friends into coming, and then there's a little boom in an area. And then that teacher passes, and then, as happened with the teacher I mentioned, some of his or her students carry it on in an honest, decent way. But there are a few who decide they want to make some money off of it or get some extra influence out of it. And then that sort of thing tends to happen, not just in the USA.